William Herbert Wallace was a quiet man, mild-mannered and intelligent. He worked as an insurance collections agent for the Prudential Insurance Company in Liverpool, and in his spare time he lectured in chemistry at the Liverpool Technical College. He also liked to play chess occasionally at Liverpool Central Chess Club, where he had been a member for 8 years, though he freely admitted he didn't have the application to be a great player. On the evening of the 19th of January 1931, while playing a game of chess at Cottle's Cafe in North John Street, where the chess club was meeting, Samuel Beattie, the club captain, handed him a message which he had taken down from a phone call he had received some 25 minutes before Wallace had arrived at the club. The message requested that Wallace meet the caller, M Qualtrough, at 7:30 the following evening, at 25 Menlove Gardens East in Liverpool South, to discuss business. Although Beattie had suggested to Mr. Qualtrough that as Wallace was expected at the club soon, he should call back later, Qualtrough had said he wished to leave a message. Wallace expressed his surprise at the unusual name, Qualtrough. Qualtrough? Qualtrough? I don't know him. He was not familiar with Menlove Gardens East, and had never received such a message, or any message, at the chess club before. Nevertheless, the following day, after Wallace had finished his work for the day, he returned home to 29 Wolverton Street, Anfield, which he shared with his wife Julia. At 6:45 p.m. his wife saw him off as he left his house by the back door, and he caught a total of 3 tramcars to the south of the city, speaking to a conductor and ticket inspector 4 times about the whereabouts of Menlove Gardens East. They directed him to Menlove Avenue, which, they reasoned, was in the vicinity of Menlove Gardens East, and Wallace explained to them that he was a stranger to the area, and that he was going to meet a Mr. Qualtrough. On his arrival at Menlove Avenue, he discovered there was a Menlove Gardens North, South and West, but no Menlove Gardens East. Puzzled by this, he made inquiries of a number of people, including a policeman on his beat. All told him the same thing: there was no Menlove Gardens East. He spoke to the policeman for about 5 minutes, and told him of Qualtrough and his peculiar message, and took out his watch to check the time, and he observed it was still before 8. The policeman reciprocated and took out his watch and declared it to be 8:15. He visited a post office and asked to see a telephone directory, but they didn't have one. He called at a nearby newsagent's, who did, and he looked for Qualtrough at any of the Menlove Gardens addresses, but found none. He told the newsagent's manageress of his mission also, and then went on his way. He called at 25 Menlove Gardens West, in case there had been a mistake in the transcription of the message, but the people at number 25 knew nothing of Mr. Qualtrough. North and South Menlove Gardens availed him no better, as neither of these streets had the number 25 in them. He recalled that his manager, Mr. Crewe, from the Prudential Insurance Company, lived nearby in this part of the city, and he decided to call on him to inquire as to any intelligence he might give on the matter of Menlove Gardens East. But he received no reply at Mr. Crewe's house, and he was clearly not at home. He therefore decided to abandon the elusive Qualtrough and the seemingly non-existent Menlove Gardens East, and made the journey back home to 29 Wolverton Street in the north of the city. On his arrival home, he found he could not gain entry to the front door of the house, which is where he would normally enter when returning late in the evening, and so he tried the back door, but could not open that either. He seems to have tried both front and back entrances several times, and then resorted to knocking to rouse his wife, but could not do so. At this point his next-door neighbours, Mr. and Mrs Johnston, emerged from their house and inquired what the matter was. He told them he was unable to gain entry to his house, and asked if they had heard anything unusual in the past hour or so. They had not, and Mr. Johnston suggested that Wallace try the door again. He did so, This time it opened, and Wallace expressed his surprise at its doing so, and he went inside while the Johnstons waited outside. They saw him strike a match, saw the light go on upstairs, and heard him call, presumably to his wife Julia, a couple of times. Then saw the kitchen light come on, and he reappeared from the doorway, calling to them, "Oh, come and see, she's been killed." Upon entering the parlour, the Johnstons saw Julia Wallace lying on the floor face down with severe head injuries. She was clearly dead, although Mrs Johnston felt for a pulse. "They've finished her," he said. "Look at her brains." There was a great deal of blood on the floor, and the effects of the violence done to her had dispersed it around the room somewhat. While Mr Johnston went off to fetch a policeman, Wallace and Mrs Johnston lit the fire in the parlour. They noticed that Wallace's raincoat was adjacent to Julia's body, and was covered in blood, and Wallace exclaimed, "Why, whatever was she doing with her mackintosh and my mackintosh?" William Herbert Wallace was born in Milham, Cumberland, in 1878. When he was 10 years old, the family moved to Blackpool, and thence returned to Cumberland. He left school at 14 and began working as a draper's assistant in Barrow-in-Furness. In 1898, Wallace moved to Manchester, worked there for 5 years as a draper's assistant, and then, at the age of 25, he moved to Calcutta when an opening in his firm arose there. That was in 1903, and while in India he suffered kidney problems, which seemed to be a lifelong affliction, and he moved to Shanghai for a while before returning to England in 1907 due to ill health. He had a kidney removed at St Guy's Hospital in London, and after recuperating went to work as an elections agent for the Liberal Party in Harrogate. Here he met Julia Dennis in 1911, and they married, moving to Liverpool in 1914 and settling in 29 Wolverton Street in 1915. Here they lived until that fateful evening when he discovered Julia battered to death on the floor of the parlour. Constable Williams arrived by bicycle at 9:10 p.m. and went over the property with Wallace. Upstairs in one of the bedrooms there were some pound notes in a jar on a table. Wallace picked them up, but Williams told him to put them back and not to touch anything. One of the bedrooms had pillows and bedclothes thrown onto the floor, but otherwise there were no signs of disturbance upstairs. Downstairs, Julia's handbag was untouched, and no valuables had been taken. A cupboard had its door wrenched off and lay on the floor. A tin cash box on a high shelf had £4 missing from it, and had been replaced on the shelf. Superintendent Hewart Moore arrived at 29 Wolverton Street at 10:05 p.m, and a pathologist, Professor McFall. Moore heard Wallace's account of the evening and then went through the house with him again. The only additional information he gleaned from this was a spot of congealed blood he found in the toilet pan, and observed that the bedroom, which showed signs of disturbance, did not strike him as looking like the work of a thief. Although bedclothes and pillows lay about the room, the wardrobe door was closed, and the drawers in a dressing table were shut. Downstairs he inquired about the mackintosh lying beside the body, and Wallace confirmed that it belonged to him, and that he had worn it that morning, but left it at the house at lunchtime that day. It was observed also that the raincoat was partially burnt. No weapon was found at the house, but it was assumed that the crime had been committed using a heavy blunt object. Later it emerged that an iron bar was missing from the kitchen. Superintendent Moore then tried the door lock, and found that although it was defective, with a little jiggling it could be opened without much difficulty. Wallace told Moore it had been like that for some time, but that on this day he had been unable to overcome its defects for some reason. The pathologist, McFall, examined the body of Julia Wallace and determined that the cause of death was from a heavy blow being repeatedly administered to the skull on the left side of the head and rear, but that the first blow had probably killed her, rendering the subsequent blows superfluous. He also determined that about 1.5 pints of blood had been lost by the victim, and that death would have occurred 2 hours earlier, though later that evening he decided it would have been 4 hours earlier, at approximately 6 p.m, but possibly an hour either side of this. His estimation concerning time of death was made by means of observing the degree to which rigor mortis had advanced in the body, which he later acknowledged was not a reliable means of determining time of death, because of variance between bodies and different physical types, and so forth. Wallace made 2 statements to the police in the following days, and the police took statements from a number of people, including the neighbours, the Johnstons, Beattie, who had taken the message from Mr Qualtrough at the chess club, and others. The phone call from Qualtrough seemed important from the outset, since it had been the means, presumably, by which the killer had ensured the absence of Wallace from the house at the time of the murder. But in spite of the police's extensive inquiries, they were unable to trace M Qualtrough, and the 4 people who possessed this surname in the Liverpool phone book knew nothing of the phone call or of Wallace. Julia Wallace was a private lady of 69 years of age, considerably older than Wallace, although this was not known at the time, as she appeared to have given her age as 52. She had no enemies, and both she and her husband appeared to be a private couple who enjoyed the theatre, concerts, music, and each other's company. She played the piano well, and Wallace had been learning the violin in the past 2 years to accompany her in their music evenings together. There was nothing in the Wallaces or in his or her lives which suggested such a frenzied and pointless act of violence would end her life. Julia had very little in the way of savings, possessions, or life insurance. Her clothes were often homemade, and nothing out of the ordinary could be said of the childless couple who had been married for 18 years. Wallace was well thought of by his employers. He was hard-working in spite of recurrent illness, and the couple were modestly prosperous. William Wallace was able to give police a detailed account of his journey to South Liverpool in search of M Qualtrough and Menlove Gardens East, the people he had met with, and a description of them. This enabled the police to locate these people, and to receive accounts from them to corroborate Wallace's story. As there had been no break-in at the house, it was assumed that Mrs Wallace, who was of a nervous disposition, must have admitted her killer to the house, and Wallace was asked for a list of people whom she would have admitted. They investigated all of these, and exonerated them from any possible involvement. Then the police had a startling breakthrough, which altered the course of their investigation. The public telephone used by M Qualtrough to call the Liverpool Chess Club was identified by a stroke of good fortune. Whoever had made the call on the evening prior to the murder had had problems getting connected to the chess club, and had had to go through the operator. She had made the connection, but in doing so, she had made a note of the details of the call, because it was post office policy to do so where any problem with connection was encountered. She had noted the call had been made at 7:15 p.m. and had come from telephone call box Anfield 1627. This phone box was just 400 yards from Wallace's house. By an extraordinary coincidence, Wallace had told the police in an earlier statement that he had left his house for the chess club on the evening at about 7:15 p.m, and that he had posted a letter in the vicinity of the phone box before catching a tramcar there. Of course, when Wallace had volunteered this information as to his whereabouts on the evening prior to the murder, he could not have known that the location of the phone box from which the call by Mr Qualtrough was made would be identified. The operator who had taken Qualtrough's call described his voice as ordinary. The woman at the chess club cafe who had answered the call also described it as ordinary. But Beattie, who had taken the message, said the voice was strong, gruff, and confident. Police began to suspect that M Qualtrough was none other than William Herbert Wallace, and that the phone call had been devised as a means of establishing an alibi for Wallace on the following evening. The police pieced together a peculiar and suggested narrative of the events leading to Julia's death, involving Wallace's journey across Liverpool, the interactions he had had upon his way, the non-existent 25 Menlove Gardens East, and the untraceable M Qualtrough. In particular, the police discovered the telephone number of the chess club was not listed in the phone book and was known only to chess club members. A casual stranger could not therefore have easily obtained it, although a visitor to the cafe would. Although the chess club had a fixtures list on its notice board, which could be seen by anyone who visited the cafe, it was seldom adhered to, and members often would not turn up. Wallace himself was an infrequent visitor to the club, and on the evening in question, his own chess partner for the evening had not turned up. The police reasoned, therefore, that Qualtrough could not have been sure that his message would even be delivered to Wallace on that evening, and thus would be unable to rely on Wallace's absence for the following evening. The phone box was 400 yards from Wallace's front door, which he said he had left at about 7:15. The call was made at 7:15 and connection was made at 7:20. It meant that Wallace would have been at the phone box at precisely the time the call was being made to the chess club. Wallace had then caught a tramcar from the area of the call box only minutes later. At the chess club, on receiving the message from Qualtrough some 25 minutes later, Wallace had discussed the peculiar name Qualtrough and Menlove Gardens East with members of the club. On his journey home later, he had returned to the subject with a man named Caird. On the evening of the murder, Wallace caught the tramcar and subsequent connections to Menlove Avenue, speaking several times to conductors and a ticket inspector, telling them quite unnecessary details of his journey, of M Qualtrough and Menlove Gardens East. It seemed to the police that his conversations were often superfluous. He repeated points and gave all the appearance of trying to ensure that he was remembered by those he interacted with. He sought to establish the time with the policeman, even manipulating the policeman into consulting his watch by alluding to the time vaguely. On his return to the house in 29 Wolverton Street, he had claimed he could not gain entry to the house, although when his neighbour Mrs Johnston suggested he try again, it opened without trouble. The police believed that he had wished to have witnesses present when he discovered the body. The police arrested Wallace, and on the 2nd of February he was charged with the murder of Julia Wallace. The trial of William Herbert Wallace began on the 22nd of April at Liverpool Crown Court and was heard by Justice Robert Wright. There was much discussion of the forensic evidence, and the time of death given by the pathologist Professor McFall was comprehensively dismissed. Other experts were highly critical of his antiquated method of using rigor mortis as a means of establishing the time of death. His other evidence concerning where the victim had been attacked proved erroneous also. The trial of Wallace and the question of his guilt rested largely on the time available to him in which he could have committed the crime. Julia Wallace had been seen by a witness at 6:38 p.m. Wallace was on the tramcar at 7:06 p.m. Various tests undertaken by the police established that it took between 14 and 20 minutes to walk the distance to the tramcar stop. Given that Wallace was 52 years old and not a fit physical specimen, it has always been argued that it would take him nearer 20 minutes than 14. This meant that he must have left the house at 7:46 p.m. at the latest, giving him a window of opportunity of just 8 minutes to commit the murder and leave the house. Various expert testimonies were given to show that whoever had attacked Mrs. Wallace had done so with such ferocity that they would inevitably have been spattered with a great deal of blood. The prosecution argued that this was the purpose of the raincoat which Wallace had tried to insinuate that she had been wearing to keep warm. The defence argued also that she may have put the raincoat on because she had a visitor. But the police believed that the killer had worn it to protect themselves from the inevitable blood spatter, and had subsequently removed it and placed it next to Julia Wallace to imply that she had been wearing it. The defence argued that even so there would be much blood on Wallace's legs and shoes, yet when he was seen by the police on the evening of the murder, and had been examined by Inspector Gold, no trace of blood was found on him. The prosecution even suggested that he may have been nude beneath the raincoat, had attacked Julia, washed and then dressed and left the house. But it was established that the bath had not been used that day. The judge summed up and declared that the evidence simply did not prove beyond reasonable doubt that Wallace had killed his wife. There was no weapon found, no motive could be established. They seemed a happy couple, and if Wallace had killed her, then this was a very premeditated crime, and to what purpose had he done so? Wallace's alibi appeared to leave him very little, if any, opportunity to commit the crime, and the judge asked the jury to consider all this. The jury did so, and, to the surprise of many, unanimously declared that Wallace was guilty. The judge accordingly donned the black cap and pronounced sentence of death upon William Herbert Wallace. An appeal was lodged by Wallace's defence team, and it was heard on the 18th and 19th of May 1931 at the Criminal Appeals Court by Lord Chief Justice Hewart and Justices Branson and Hawke. Wallace was escorted from Liverpool to Pentonville and brought before the court for his final appeal. The date of his execution had been scheduled for a few weeks hence. The judges considered the matter, retired, and then ruled to allow the appeal, quashing the original verdict on the basis that the evidence did not support the verdict. In other words, that the jury was wrong. The press were generally quite fair to Wallace. No one else was ever arrested for the murder of Julia Wallace, and the crime was never solved. It has been studied over the years, and opinions in the matter have varied greatly, with many famous writers and students of criminology offering possible solutions, all, of course, regarding their own solutions as being the correct ones. The writer P.D. James devised an ingenious but unlikely solution, which was based on the idea that Qualtrough was a prank call, but that Wallace used it as the means to commit the crime. Others have seized on the fact that Wallace alluded to an acquaintance of his as being the true culprit, a man named Richard Gordon Parry, who was a minor thief. In 1981, a writer claimed to have solved the crime by finding a garage owner who claimed that Parry had virtually confessed the crime to him on the evening of the murder 50 years earlier. As Parry had died in 1980, he felt he could now come forward with the truth. But there are many problems with the idea that Parry was the killer. He had a cast-iron alibi supplied to him by at least 2 different witnesses, independently at the time. The motive for such a brutal and frenzied murder does not seem to fit his style of petty thieving. What purpose could there be in distracting Wallace from the scene when his wife would clearly still be at home, unless he planned to kill her? And for what motive? At least one other writer has claimed that the Johnstons, the next-door neighbours, killed her, as they had a key which fitted the Wallace's door, and admitted to this. They were in a position to observe the absences of Wallace, to make the phone call from the phone box at the time Wallace walked by. But the motive of a few pounds in cash, not even taking the money from her handbag or from upstairs, is a heavy charge upon which to rest a charge of murder to otherwise respectable people. There are others who, with varying degrees of certainty, have been assigned the status of the true killer. Where there is murder, and especially where there is the slightest element of doubt, there is open season for conjecture, it seems. But there is one person who has always been central to this crime, who lived in its shadow, and whose quashed conviction did not, of course, alter the plain fact that he is the only man whom a jury have found guilty. That man is William Herbert Wallace. The fact that the jury found Wallace guilty is often attributed to public hostility towards him at the time, and to the fact that he resembled Crippen in appearance in certain respects. This is not entirely convincing, and it unfairly disparages the jury. Of course, juries may be prejudiced, but what often is described as prejudice is in fact sound but unpalatable reasoning. The evidence against Wallace is certainly not complete, but it remains compelling. Qualtrough is a highly unusual name. None of those who came across it in Wallace's conversations appear to have known it. Its sole distinguishing feature is that it attracts attention because of its very unfamiliarity. This leads to the suspicion that it was selected as a name for the meeting with Wallace on that basis alone. But who would it serve to use a unique name? If the object was simply to lure Wallace from the house, then any name would do, and would be more believable. Only one person could benefit from the selection of such a name: William Wallace. That name would be remarkable. It would invite comment and be remembered, and thus help establish his alibi. The choice of 25 Menlove Gardens East is likewise carefully chosen. The fact that there is a north, south, and west Menlove Gardens makes a Menlove Gardens East logical and provides an expectation that there would be one. In fact, only someone familiar with the area would doubt it. But why would anyone choose a false address in a non-existent road? Had the purpose of the assignation been simply to detain Wallace, far from his home for a period of time, then an address more distant in the city would have accomplished this and been far safer from a third party's perspective. A false address would be likely to be discovered. Wallace spent his life travelling around Liverpool, collecting insurance for the Prudential, and like all agents, he had access to street directories and maps of the city. Surely if the area was unfamiliar to him, he would have looked it up during the day. That he didn't is instructive in itself. But the choice of Menlove Gardens East, by virtue of its ambiguity, suited Wallace and no other person. It furnished him with a reason not only for being away from his home for the requisite period, but for inquiring about its location as he wandered about the area. It enabled him to hold many superfluous conversations with a large number of people, including a policeman, a newsagent, conductors and a ticket collector, people who would easily be able to corroborate his account of his journey. It was not enough for him to have been seen to have boarded a tram to a distant place at a certain time and to have been absent for a period of time. He had to be able to give a full account of that time and have it confirmed by others. That is something which a distant place could not achieve for him, because it would remove the necessity of constant corroboration of his presence by others, and that is why Menlove Gardens East was vital to Wallace's plan. That is also why he had to persist in looking for Menlove Gardens East, even after he was told there was no such place. On Wallace's return to 29 Wolverton Street, he did not enter the house because, he claimed, he could not gain access to it. Why could he not gain access to his house? He knew of the faulty locks. When the neighbour Johnston suggested he try again, it opened. When Superintendent Moore tried the lock an hour later, he saw at once the lock was faulty. but that it could be opened nonetheless with a little jiggling. Wallace had lived in the house for 15 years. He knew better than anyone else the defects of the lock and how to manipulate it to overcome these. There was only one objective in using the excuse of the reluctant lock to exclude himself from the house, and that was to ensure that he could only gain access when someone else was present to complete his narrative of accounting for his every moment over the previous 2 hours. Had Mr. and Mrs. Johnston not emerged from their house at that moment, it would have been necessary for Wallace to have made greater noise to rouse them, or other neighbours, to provide witness to his entry. The sheer brutality of the attack upon Mrs. Wallace was characteristic of a frenzied attack, which suggested that a maniac had committed the crime. But in fact it was shown that Mrs. Wallace had suffered an initial blow of such severity to her head that it had caved in the side of her skull. Her death was instantaneous. A series of 10 further and much lighter blows were administered quite unnecessarily to the back of the head while she lay face down, where she was found, and this seems to suggest that it was done to create an impression of a frenzied attack, rather than its actually being one. Wallace, by all accounts, was a mild man, who would not seem to be capable of such violence. It did, of course, carry the further advantage of ensuring that a great deal of blood spatter would characterize the murder scene, thus making it unavoidable that the murderer would be covered in blood. A clean and unbloodied Wallace would not be suspected. The mackintosh raincoat found beside the body and partially tucked beneath the victim was covered in blood, and the burns on it were, the prosecution suggested, likely to be attempts by Wallace to burn the coat to destroy it. The defence claimed that it is likely it was burnt as a result of coming into contact with the gas fire, which must have been lit because Julia's skirt was also burned. It is difficult to make much sense either way with this piece of evidence. 2 burnt matches were found in a fold of the raincoat as it lay there. Whatever the cause of the burn marks to the raincoat and Julia's skirt, it does not seem to alter the main facts in any way. The position of the coat in a bunch and partially tucked beneath her does not seem consistent with the suggestion that she was wearing it, but it does seem reasonable to suppose it to have been utilized in the crime and then positioned near the body to conceal that use. But who would wish to conceal its use other than William Wallace? It could not serve any random assailant to try to conceal such a fact of its use, because nothing could be gleaned of them from its use. But for Wallace, the fact of his not being spattered in blood was an important factor in his defence. He had good reason to conceal the purpose of the raincoat, and he made an attempt at the outset to establish such a narrative by exclaiming, "What was she doing with my mackintosh?" When the location of the phone box from which the Qualtrough phone call was made was uncovered, it was an unforeseen error. He had no way of knowing that the post office logged such problem calls. That it was logged enabled the police to pinpoint its location, and it immediately placed Wallace under suspicion. If someone else had wished to make the call to Wallace, then they could have done so while he was at the chess club, and thence had a perfect assurance that he would visit them. But even if we accept that such a person could not speak to Wallace, since Wallace would recognize his voice, there was no need for him to make the call 400 yards from Wallace's home at a time when he would have been very close to the phone box. There can be no reasonable doubt that Wallace was at the phone box or passing it at the precise time the call was being made. It may not prove that Wallace made the call, but it makes it highly likely. If it was someone whom Wallace knew, then he stood a very good chance of recognizing him, because he was passing the phone box as the call was being made. Only one person knew that Wallace would be at the chess club that evening of the 19th of January, William Wallace. The existence of a notice board with a list of names would give no assurance of it. or even a probability of his attendance. Furthermore, if someone wished to kill Julia Wallace and or Rob Wallace, then the surest way of ensuring that Wallace was absent was in taking the opportunity of Wallace's absence at the chess club to do so. If they knew he was to be at the chess club, then they knew that they had such an opportunity. And as the police discovered that Qualtrough was 400 yards from the Wallace's home at the time of the phone call, they clearly had a perfect opportunity at that very moment. In fact, they will have seen Wallace walk by on his way to Cottle's Cafe. The creation of a fictitious Qualtrough suited Wallace because he was able to suggest a third person was responsible for the murder, and it provided him with the necessary time window his absence from the house required. The iron bar, which was estimated to be 12 inches by 1 inch, and that was present in the kitchen but was missing from the murder scene, was never found. Why would a killer have taken the iron bar? It could hardly implicate them further in the crime, as it was understood that this bar was the murder weapon. Its removal wouldn't help a random stranger, merely increase their risk of being caught. But it would suit Wallace to extract this from the murder scene, because by doing so it again implies his innocence, because he has the additional difficulty of disposing of it whilst on his visible wild goose chase across South Liverpool. Menlove Gardens was an area he was familiar with. He had done business there and even taken violin lessons in the area 2 years previously. Of course, none of this is foolproof. None of it is probably sufficient to hang a man, but it is highly suggestive. The most problematic factor in the entire affair, though, is that of motive. The prosecution was sufficiently troubled by it to dismiss it at the beginning of the trial as not being of special relevance in view of the compelling nature of the evidence. But of course, human beings are rational creatures, and even when behaving irrationally, they lay down a process by which their actions may be explained. In the case of William Herbert Wallace, no such motive can be established that does not take us into the realms of speculation. No quarrel between the couple could be found, no financial motive existed, and not a single trace of another woman could be found, or another man. That absence of apparent motive is Wallace's greatest defence. It has been suggested that this was the ultimate game of chess for Wallace, and there certainly are elements in it which suggest careful, well-thought-out moves, each move offering certain advantages to his own position and certain elements of risk. Wallace was portrayed at the time as a grand master who had manipulated every aspect of the murder, and this was doubtless suggested by the fact that the story began with a chess match at the Liverpool Central Chess Club. It is this aspect which has led some people to describe the case as the perfect murder. Raymond Chandler thought so. P.D. James, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, and many others have been aficionados of the Wallace case and advanced their own solutions. But if it was a game of chess, it was far from perfect. It may well have reflected the fact that Wallace was not really a very good player, and was in the second division of the Liverpool Chess Club, and freely acknowledged that he hadn't the application to be a great player. On the evening of the chess match, he had been very excited, and this may have been due to the fact that he had won his match, which it seems was not a usual occurrence, or it may have been because his plan had begun its irrevocable course. It is not known what happened on that night of the 20th of January 1931, when Julia Wallace was murdered whilst her husband was wandering around South Liverpool on an improbable mission, and it takes us into an area that will always be one of pure speculation. But I give here, with this caveat and many reservations, my own belief as to what took place. William Herbert Wallace was by every account a mild-mannered and reserved man, quiet and somewhat insulated from the world. He enjoyed the controlled society of the chess club rather than any uncontrolled social intercourse. When he was at home, he preferred to spend his time with his chemistry experiments in a small bedroom he had converted into a laboratory or workshop for this purpose. He was a careful man, curious, not religious, but with a belief in the order of the universe. Little is known of his wife, Julia, whom it has only recently been discovered was in her 50s at the time of her marriage to Wallace, who was 17 years her junior. But we know she was also very private and kept herself to herself, that she enjoyed playing the piano and rarely went out. Wallace kept a diary which was quoted in court. He had started writing it 3 years before the tragedy, and as far as we know he had not done so before this time. It carries many observations of a thoughtful nature, and many that are humdrum, but a theme that runs through it is of his seemingly idyllic life and his abiding love for his wife Julia. To a modern mind its narrative seems improbable. Wallace had been married for 18 years, and after such a time the guilt has inevitably worn off most, perhaps all, marriages. Yet the Wallaces' marriage seems curiously untouched by the passage of time. Perhaps in 1931, committing even the most private of thoughts to a diary, came with certain conventions, and his expressions of love for his wife may be read in that context. But it may also be that it offers an alternative interpretation. That Wallace had envisaged his plan, or embarked upon it, 3 years before its occurrence. That the diary was conceived as a means of establishing a perfect marriage, and ensuring that no motive could attach itself to the nature of their relationship or its deficiencies. As Wallace walked endlessly around the streets of Liverpool, as he had done for 17 years in his work as an agent for the Peru, he had endless opportunity for reflection and to refine and rehearse his plan. He became familiar with Menlove Avenue. We know he had been there a number of times, and perhaps the peculiarity of the existence of the north, south and west versions of Menlove Gardens, and the conspicuous absence of the east, had long struck him as offering a certain potential. We know that 2 years prior to the murder Wallace had begun learning to play the violin, apparently with the objective of playing it in accompaniment to his wife Julia's piano playing. He took lessons from his supervisor, Crewe, in the vicinity of Menlove Gardens, and this may have been with the intention of supporting the narrative of the close relationship the Wallaces had. If it was part of a plan, then Wallace certainly knew how to play a long, patient game. But is there any evidence to support such an idea? A little. A work colleague, Alfred Mather, described Wallace as the most cool, calculating, despondent and soured man with an evil temper who considered his job to be beneath him. He also described Julia as offhand, who believed she had married beneath herself with William. A nurse who had nursed William in 1923 during one of his prolonged bouts of illness described the Wallaces as a very strange couple, with a strained attitude towards each other. She said that Julia was odd in manner and dirty. Wallace's doctor said Mrs. Wallace regarded Wallace as a malingerer, and when Julia became ill he said that Wallace was indifferent. This may hint at a less than idyllic marriage than that which Wallace liked to portray. It may be that in spite of the beliefs of those who had a small glimpse of the world of the Wallaces, that things were not quite so perfect as Wallace liked to pretend. He may have found her oppressive, or perhaps he felt his life was too claustrophobic, and being married to an elderly woman did not suit him. If there is any substance in this, then in January 1931 Wallace was ready to put his plan into action. He left the house at about 7:15 p.m, bound for the chess club. When he reached the phone box 4 minutes from his house, he made the fateful call to the chess club. He could not make a connection and had to go through the operator, and he spoke to the woman in the cafe also, asking for Beattie. With neither of these people he felt it necessary to disguise his voice, but when Beatty came to the phone it became necessary. Beatty knew him, and he must on no account suspect that he was speaking to Wallace. So Wallace disguised his voice by speaking heavily, confidently and gruffly. He left the message for Wallace, naturally declining to call back later to speak to Wallace, and introduced the information of M Qualtrough and 25 Menlove Gardens. Wallace then caught the tram to the cafe where the chess club met. He commenced his game and waited. In due course Beatty came and passed him the phone message. It was an unusual circumstance. He had never received a message at the chess club before, but he naturally commented on the strange name, Qualtrough. He drew the attention of others to the name and queried Menlove Gardens East. The following day Wallace went about his collections business as usual. He was home at lunchtime and apparently left his mackintosh at the house then. Later he returned home, and at 6:38 Julia took the paper and had words with the paper boy. May even have been engineered by his suggesting to Julia that she take the paper personally from the paper boy, because it had the effect of establishing a time at which he was certainly alive. Soon thereafter, but before 6:45 p.m, he contrived for his wife to enter the parlour. While she was there, he picked up the iron bar and hit her a single forceful blow to the side of the head, which killed her instantly. He donned the mackintosh and hit her 10 more times, which created considerable blood spatter by design. There are numerous possibilities as to how he guarded against the inevitable blood spatter, but the easiest and simplest of all would be to kneel down to administer the subsequent 10 blows. A cloth could then be used to wrap the iron bar in, and it would easily fit in his greatcoat pocket for carrying from the house and disposal. In any case, he tucked the mackintosh under Julia and wrenched the door from the cupboard before donning his overcoat and leaving the house by the back door, possibly bidding Julia goodbye and asking her to lock the door behind him for the benefit of anyone who might hear him. It has been argued that Wallace would have had no time to commit the murder and clean himself up in the space of 7 or 8 minutes. But this was more than enough time. Wallace would have had to do this in the shortest time possible if his alibi was to have any traction. He needed to allow himself the shortest possible time for the very reason that otherwise it would destroy his alibi. 7 minutes was ample time to kill Julia and complete the entire process up to leaving the back door. In fact, it would have taken no more than 3 minutes, from start to finish, to remove the raincoat and clean or conceal any spatter on himself, and to conceal the weapon in his coat before leaving the house. He then went directly to the tram stop and caught the tram at 7:06 p.m. He spoke to the conductor about Menlove Gardens East to ensure that it could be established that he was on the tram at 7:06. It was vital that he established this. He was obliged to be quite insistent to the conductor concerning Menlove Gardens, and to offer the superfluous information about Qualtrough and his own status as a stranger to the place. Although this was labouring the point and incurring certain risks, it was most necessary that the conductor should remember him, so the risk had to be taken. That he was on the tram at 7:06 was the most important part of his alibi. Of course, it was not enough that he had established that he had been on the tram at 7:06. He had to maintain this by engaging other tram conductors and even a ticket collector in conversation concerning Menlove Gardens East and Qualtrough. When he arrived at his destination, he then needed to establish that he was indeed there for a prescribed period, and did so by inquiring of various people where Menlove Gardens East was. Nor did he accept it when he was told the street did not exist. He could not accept it, because it was not his true objective, but was simply a means of establishing his alibi. Nor was it enough to ask strangers in the street. After all, random strangers might not be traced easily. they might not come forward when police appealed for such witnesses. Wallace needed people who would be traced. The policeman on his beat was engaged for 5 minutes approximately. Wallace took out his watch and alluded with uncertainty to the time, thus ensuring that the policeman would consult his own watch. He spoke to the newsagent in a contrived conversation. She was not interested in what Wallace was looking for or who he was visiting, so he had to volunteer the information to her in a contrived manner. It was a risk, but it was necessary because she was someone who he could be sure would be traced. At some point during his travels in Liverpool, he discarded the iron bar and any wrapping, gloves and so forth he may have used. He visited his supervisor, Mr. Crewe, and found he was not in. He may have intended to spend the evening there and have visited Crewe earlier to provide a cast-iron alibi, but Crewe's absence was unforeseen, and may have forced him into seeking other witnesses as he wandered about the roads. He called at 25 Menlove Gardens West and made inquiries about Qualtrough there, again establishing a certainty of being remembered at a fixed location. Then he returned home. It was now very important that he should not enter the house alone without a witness, because the discovery of the murder would complete his alibi for the hours prior to the murder. He therefore pretended he could not gain access to his front door or to his back door. Subsequently, of course, he could use the fact of the defective lock to explain why he had been unable to gain entry to the house. He was seen at last by his neighbours, the Johnstons, who were leaving their house. Had they not done so, it would have been necessary for him to make sufficient noise to attract their attention or that of other neighbours. He plied them with the idea of something being amiss by asking whether they had heard anything unusual in the past hour or so. Of course they hadn't, because nothing unusual had happened in the past hour. He was now able to open the door without any difficulty. He did so, and went up the stairs, calling out to his wife. He now threw some of the clothes around one of the bedrooms, to make the room look disturbed by a burglar. Of course he couldn't make much noise at this, because his neighbours were waiting at an open door. That may be why the disturbance was unconvincing to the police, and the failure to leave drawers and wardrobe door open would of course look unnatural to a policeman used to contemplating a typical crime scene. Then he came downstairs and lit the lamp, and discovered the body. In the house he had drawn Mrs. Johnston's attention to the mackintosh, because its presence would obviously attract police attention. He was already creating the narrative which must attach to the mackintosh. Up until this point everything had, more or less, gone to plan, and the murder seemed inexplicable, and such discrepancies as existed would make it very difficult to pin the crime on Wallace. Then days later the phone evidence emerged, which not only placed the Qualtrough phone call 400 yards from Wallace's front door, but placed Wallace in its immediate vicinity at the time the call was made. It was an unforeseen move. If it was a game of chess, then it was a terrible blunder, possibly characteristic of Wallace's own chess matches. The police had established that it was possible for Wallace to have committed the murder. The identification of Wallace as the person who had almost certainly made the Qualtrough call made him the likely murderer, because it seems an inescapable conclusion that whoever made that call killed Julia Wallace. The jury has been criticised for ignoring the judge's directions in finding Wallace guilty, for showing bias, prejudice even. This is quite wrong. The jury was unanimous in its verdict. Perhaps the legal proofs were insufficient, but they saw that in spite of the defence's and judge's reservations, Wallace could have committed the murder, and they believed that as Wallace did indeed appear to have made the Qualtrough call, he was likely to be the murderer. It is my belief that the jury were right to convict. I believe that something along the lines I have proposed is what happened. Of course, where there is reason, there is doubt. In the most certain of cases, arguments can and are found to exonerate the accused. It is a characteristic of human ingenuity that they are able to argue that black is white, and this must give hope to every guilty person behind bars. William Herbert Wallace is an unusual and sympathetic character. It has been said that the Wallace case was a triumph of the best judicial system in the world. That is quite absurd. If you believe Wallace was guilty, then he got away with it. If you believe him innocent, then he was very nearly hanged. Either outcome is equally served by the observation that it is secured in spite of British justice rather than in consequence of it. On reflection, I will only say that William Herbert Wallace probably got away with murder. After the trial and successful appeal, Wallace was freed and he returned to work with the Prudential Insurance Company, although he was assigned a desk job as he was unable to continue as a collections agent in view of the public hostility directed towards him. The press regarded him favourably in general, but he was abused in the streets. He moved out of Liverpool to the Wirral, where he settled in a small bungalow in Bromborough, called Summer House, in Meadowside Road. Here he tended his garden and maintained his diary, which he had started 3 years before the murder. He led a quiet, introspective and somewhat forlorn existence after his acquittal, and any satisfaction he felt at his reprieve from the gallows in 1931 was short-lived, because within 2 years he suffered a recurrence of his kidney disease, and he died in Clatterbridge Hospital on the Wirral on the 26th of February 1933. He was 54 years old. He was buried at Anfield Cemetery beside his wife, Julia.